He was an expert amongst experts. If Vance said that based on the science that he had done in his laboratory that you were guilty, you were guilty. There was no second opinion. If a criminal knew that Vance was on his case, they would just give up and admit it because they knew that they couldn't get past Vance's science.
There was just nothing like him at the time, and I just find it amazing that he's just been forgotten. He was called the Sherlock Holmes of Canada by the international media, and yet no one's heard of him here. He should be a significant part of Vancouver's history.
His name was John Fleming Cullen Brown Vance. The 1930s were a really difficult time for the police department. It was the Depression, there was mass unemployment, there was mass public disturbances. But it was also a time when the doors opened up for increased sciences, and that's really that time period when the door opened up for Vance.
Our police department was the only police department in Canada that had a forensic science service, and probably one of the few in North America. There was very little around, so Vance was basically it.
He was able to provide a new level of proof. He could take apart people's alibis, and based on the tiniest little piece of fiber found on you or piece of soil, he can prove that you were there.
And you've got to remember, this is half a century before we'd even thought about DNA. This was so leading edge.
And that was something that Vancouverites had never seen before, and definitely the criminal world had never seen before.
Vance was so successful that in 1934 there were 7 attempts on his life. The first one came early in the year, and he got a couple of threatening letters into his work, into the lab. Then he received a parcel, and he started to open it, and then he looked at the writing on the parcel and recognised it as being the same as had been on these threatening letters. So he very gingerly deconstructed the bomb, and it turned out that it had enough nitroglycerin to take out the lab and most of the people in it had it gone off.
The second threat against his life is they actually had a police officer patrolling his home, and the police officer found a fuse that was lit, that was attached to a bomb attached to the back of his house. And he saw the fuse literally on fire, and he ran over, and he was actually able to defuse the bomb just in the nick of time. Just to see how effective of a bomb it was, they exploded it. And it was huge and definitely would have destroyed his home.
About a week passed and Vance was going to work to the lab. He got into his car and turned it over, and it didn't turn. And then his son, Tom, ran out from the house yelling, "Dad, Dad, there's something under your car." And they got out, and apparently the action of turning the car on had sparked the fuse and had set off the bomb. And they found a bomb shoved under the car there. But the worst attack came several months later. He saw that the window in the garage was open, so he went over to close the window. And this man jumped up and threw acid at his face. Vance was able to sort of put his hands up and protect his eyes so he wasn't blinded, but he had horrific burns all over his arms and legs and spent a couple of weeks in hospital.
Even after those attempts on his life, I think he was just so driven to learn and to apply new sciences that really nothing was going to stop him from his passion of science.
Vance was born in 1884 in Alexandria in Scotland, and he immigrated to Canada with his family and ended up in Vancouver when he was 12 years old. Finished school and became an assistant assayer or chemist with the mines. When he started as an analyst in 1907, his job was primarily working for the health department, and he gradually moved into police investigation, and it would have been through toxicology, through poisons and drugs. By 1920, about 60% of his work was for the police department, and that year alone he did over 3,200 police reports. It was absolutely staggering. They worked 6 days a week. He loved police work. I think when he started to get into that, that was his calling. You look at what he was doing with seriology, with toxicology. He was called in to investigate in arson cases. He was a document analysis with counterfeit documents and things like that. He autopsied body parts. I mean, the guy did everything way before this was done. Another really bizarre case that Vance was involved in, the RCMP contacted Vance and asked for his help on a case in the Yukon. They'd found a retired miner who was murdered in his cabin, and this guy was known to not trust banks and have a bit of money and store it in the home, so he was robbed and killed. And a couple of days later, a local man around town was seen paying off all his bills and buying presents for his girlfriend, and waved the red flag to police that there might be something there. When they arrested him, they found blood all over his clothes, and it turned out he was the meat cutter for the local butcher, and said, well, of course I've got blood all over my clothes for the butcher. And then they got Vance in. And at that time, testing for blood was quite rudimentary, and what Vance would have had to do is take it back and do a series of tests to find out that it was human blood, which he did. And the guy was convicted and confessed and hung. In 1932, Vance really comes into his own. He's made an honorary inspector, which is incredibly unusual, the police department, and he's made head of the Police Bureau of Science. And they also move into this building.
The building that the Vancouver Police Museum is in now was once the City Analyst Laboratory, which was built in 1932.
And this is 30 years after Vance had been on the job. And it was 6,000 square feet of lab space. It was truly incredible for the times. There was nothing else like it in North America. And he had a huge area for testing poisons, for autopsying body parts. He had another area for testing ballistics. It was just state-of-the-art equipment, absolutely leading edge. And when he didn't have the equipment, he just invented it. Vance was a very shy man, and that really surprised me, because when you read about him, the press just loved him. They treated him like he was this celebrity. They covered all his court cases, and he was like a magician. Criminals were so scared to go up against him in court, yet he was a really soft-spoken man that looked more like a university professor or a high school teacher than he did a scientist or a policeman. I think he just loved being in the lab. He didn't like the limelight. I don't think he loved getting up to testify in court, although he knew that that was a hugely important part of his job. What I found really interesting with him is he wasn't actually working for the police in that. He was working for the evidence. And he was very proud if the evidence found that a suspect was innocent and saved, someone from going to jail or even the death penalty back then. He felt that he was doing his job, and I think that was probably more important to him, freeing the innocent, than it was actually getting convictions.
Things became, I think, a little bit more difficult for him in and around the mid-1930s, when there was a big corruption scandal in the department, and the chief at the time was ousted. And there was a little bit of a shakeup with the finances and the resources that were allocated to different parts of the department. After that time period, the media kind of backs off from him, and we don't hear so much about him after that. He applied to retire in 1947, but it wasn't really until 1949. They actually had to split his lab into 2 separate labs headed by 2 separate scientists, which speaks, I think, a little bit to who he was as well, and his breadth of knowledge, and how effective he was in science. He
was 65 years old by then, so he'd been working 6 days a week and rarely taking any time off at all. From what I can gather, he did a bit of consulting after he retired, and then he died in 1964.
He worked on so many cases. In the first year of the City Analyst Laboratory being under the Bureau of Science, they did over 250 analysis in their first year. So if you think about how long his career was, it would have been thousands upon thousands of cases he would have worked on.
I think what fueled John Vance was the mystery, was solving a problem. I don't think he saw himself as a crusader for the victim. I think it was all about the evidence for him. It was finding the evidence that would either convict a suspect or free them.
He really set up the base for professional forensic sciences to happen in Vancouver. And all of the framework that we have for the investigations today, they're based on the innovations and the drive that Vance kind of had to set those things up in the first place. Vance put the fear of justice into a lot of criminals at the time and really changed the atmosphere of crime in Vancouver. And I think that there would have been a lot of crimes that would have gone unsolved if Vance hadn't been there with his science.